the upper room, and again, as always, we're so glad to be with you. I'm going to ask you to turn in your Bibles or your devices, whatever you have, to John chapter 3. Put your finger there or bookmark that. That's where we'll end up. But we're going to start in Luke chapter 7. So if you'll turn there, we'll spend a little time there and get on to John 3. First of all, however, I want to do a pop quiz. We do this from time to time. I'm going to give you 3 expressions that are used fairly commonly, and then I'm going to ask you to pause this lesson, pause the streaming of this lesson, and talk about what you think that expression means and where might it have come from. So I'm going to give you all 3 expressions, beginning with the first one, on to the next, and then you can pause and talk about all 3 of them. The first one is, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. All right, what does that mean? Where did it come from? The second one is, he or she is a shoo-in, a shoo-in. Okay, you've heard that before. Where did it come from? What does it mean? And the final one is, put my 2 cents in. Put my 2 cents in. What's it mean? I think you'll get what it means, but where did it come from? Have a great conversation. All right, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. The idea there is don't scrutinize something someone has given to you and consider it of no consequence. It comes from the fact that horses, and I'm no horse expert for sure, but I've read this, that you can tell an awful lot about a horse by looking in their mouth. You can tell how old they are. You can tell what kind of nutrition they've had. You can tell if they've been over-reined. A lot of those things you can examine before you purchase a horse and decide whether you want that horse. Well, any gift that you're giving, if you examine it closely before receiving it and saying, I guess I don't want it, that's called looking a gift horse in the mouth. Not a good idea. Just be gracious in receiving it. The second one, a shoe-in. It goes way back to the day when jockeys would get together and they would bet on a certain horse who they knew was slower than the other horses, but then the other horses, the jockeys would hold them back, and the one with the slower horse would urge that horse forwards, calling a shoe-in. And as a result, these jockeys, they would all win a lot of money and split the money because it was a phony contest. Because of all their pre-race bets, they were in on it. That's a shoe-in. And the idea is, someone is a shoe-in, they're a sure bet. It was a sure bet for these jockeys which horse would win. And then finally, my 2 cents, putting my 2 cents in, comes from actually the term 2 bits, which is the ante in a poker game. Which means I'm going to contribute to this game. I'm in on this game. If I put my 2 cents into a conversation, I'm in on this conversation. That's my contribution to the conversation. I'd sure be interested in knowing if you got all 3 of those correct. You know, it's amazing how many terms, the terminology that we use for different expressions come from the gambling world, really. A dicey situation, as you can imagine, comes from the gambling world. The term pass the buck and dead ringer. They're all gambling expressions. And we are in a series we're calling The Expression, but I can tell you the expression that we're talking about is no gamble. It is a sure bet. It is the real deal. So there are several times in the New Testament, Hebrews 1:3, for example, where Jesus is called the exact representation of God. And John chapter 1, verse 18, that's the series we're in, the book of John, says that he explains God to us. And so that expression is the real deal. It's a sure bet, unlike the other expressions that we use. Adam Clarke was a British theologian that lived in the later part of the 1700s, early part of the 1800s. He was actually a protege of John Wesley, the famous John Wesley. And so he gave a definition of God. Someone asked him, how would you define God? How would you explain God? And I want to give it to you, and I'm going to give you a discussion question right afterwards and ask you to unpack what he says, because it's full of all kinds of ideas. So pay attention closely as I read it. And of course, as always, your leader has this quote that you can look back on. So here's what Adam Clarke had to say about who God was. He is the eternal, independent, and self-existent being, the being whose purposes and actions spring from himself without foreign motive or influence. He who is absolute in dominion, the most pure, the most simple, the most spiritual of all essences, infinitely perfect and eternally self-sufficient, needing nothing that he has made, illimitable, limitless, as I would say it, in his immensity, inconceivable in his mode of existence, and indescribable in his essence, known fully only by himself, because an infinite mind can only be fully comprehended by itself. In a word, a being who from his infinite wisdom cannot err or be deceived, and from his infinite goodness can do nothing but what is eternally just, right, and kind. Did you get all that? See what I'm saying? You might have to go back and revisit that. Unpack that, if you will. Pull apart and look at the phrases and the definitions he uses for God and see what you think. Now, while Clarke is, without a doubt, incredibly eloquent, and I think it's a pretty complicated way to describe God, but I think it was accurate also. I wouldn't disagree with any of it. While that is true, I don't know about you, but I would rather just look to the life of Jesus and go, okay, I can understand God from how Jesus lived, how he taught, what he said, and that's what this series is about. Really, he is the expression of God, and we get to watch him, listen to him, and understand who God is, which is, if you think about it, is incredibly profound. It's beyond belief that we can come to understand, at least the way God wants us to understand him, who God is, because Jesus' life exemplified who God is. And so we'll get to that explanation of who God is through Jesus in the book of John, but I ask you to turn first to the book of Luke, chapter 7. And we're going to look at an incident, an event in the life of Jesus. We're going to kind of pick our way through it because it'll set us up for what we're going to read in John chapter 3. Here we go, verse 36 of Luke chapter 7. One of the Pharisees asked Jesus to have dinner with him. So Jesus went to his home and sat down to eat. Sat down is probably not the right terminology. In the Middle East, in that time, the homes had tables that were probably only this far off the ground, and so they reclined. They always reclined at the table, and not just reclined in any way. They reclined so that their feet were behind them. They always had walked with just sandals through desert, through dirt, had sweaty feet, and so they wanted their feet away from the table, and that's how they reclined. That becomes actually important, what's about to happen. Now, ironically, this is the first of 3 times that Dr. Luke will record a Pharisee inviting Jesus into his home for a meal. Now, what you need to know about that is none of the 3 invited him in because they were really personally interested in him, really wanted to get to know him. They all 3 wanted to trap him, wanted to study him, to find something wrong with him because he was making them look bad, and they didn't have any use for that. They didn't have any patience with that. And so this is an opportunity to trap Jesus, opportunity to find something out that they could use against him in the future. Now it begs the question, at least it did for me, is why would Jesus continue to walk into that? You know, I don't know about you, but when I know something is being set up against me, that people have it in for me, I am not likely to go into that setting. I'm likely to find an excuse not to. But Jesus, unbelievably, stepped right into it. Was he naive? Is that why he did that? I think you think probably what I'm thinking, that is, he wasn't naive at all. He welcomed the challenge because he was not ever afraid. People's opinion of him did not matter to him, and in stepping into these situations, into these settings, I believe He knew they're going to try to destroy me, but in the process, I am going to shed light on who they really are. Okay, so we pick up the story in verse 37. When a certain immoral woman from that city heard he was eating there, you know what it means by an immoral woman, right? The lady of the night. She brought a beautiful alabaster jar filled with expensive perfume. Okay, you're thinking, okay, I know this story. I know this story. Actually, this event is not talked about near as much as the other event that's like it in the last week of Jesus' life in Bethany. In John chapter 12, Mark chapter 14, Matthew 26, they all record the event in the last week of Jesus' life where he's anointed with perfume. And this is a separate event. This is not in Bethany near Jerusalem the last week. This is in Galilee, okay? So this is a whole different thing. This woman who is of ill repute comes in with this jar of really important perfume, and now we're going to see what unfolds. Verse 38, then she knelt behind him at his feet. You see how important it was to understand the setting? Now she's behind him. His feet are behind him because they all reclined at the table. She knelt behind him at his feet, weeping. Her tears fell on his feet, and she wiped them off with her hair. Then she kept kissing his feet and putting perfume on them. Whoa, there's so much packed into that. Let's kind of unpack that. And so we've got the picture. She's behind him because his feet are behind him, and she kneels down and she's weeping uncontrollably, has long hair. She wipes the tears off his feet with her hair, and then she's going to put perfume on him. And so the first thing I think of, quite honestly, is that Jesus, and I know you can say that's really shallow, Steve, Jesus does not have ticklish feet. That's the first thought I have, because my wife has such ticklish feet that if I got that close, if I tried to kiss her feet, she wouldn't do it on purpose, but she'd kick my teeth out. I'm pretty sure of it. She just recently went out and had her a pedicure done with her daughter-in-law. There was a birthday present from her daughter-in-law to Christy, and they went out and did a pedicure, and I would like to have seen how she sat still for someone touching her feet. She came home and I said, let's see them, and she put them up, her toenails up, and she said, look, don't touch. That explains it all, doesn't it? So although this is not the most important lesson, Jesus doesn't have ticklish feet, but it goes much deeper than that. All right, when she kisses his feet, it's an intense word. It's the same word for kissing that was used by Jesus when he told the story of the prodigal son. And when he finally comes home, the father kisses him. Do you think that might have been an intense moment when he kissed him? And remember, in the Middle East, I've told you before, when I was in Ukraine, men, kissing men is no big deal. I kind of shied away from that when I was in Ukraine, and I really shy away from it still. But in this setting, that's the word that's used. Also was used in Ephesians when Paul is leaving Ephesus and the church elders in Ephesus are saying goodbye and they're weeping and they're kissing him. Okay, so that's what's happening here. She didn't just bend down and peck his feet. She intensely showed affection to him. And again, the feet, were considered something you just don't want to touch in that culture. It says so much about where she's at. Now, don't miss how significant this setting is and how dangerous it is, because by all appearances, this has the makings of a scandal. A prostitute is showing affection to Jesus as though they have a prior relationship. Now, you and I look back over history and go, that's not possible. But in that moment, the people gathered in that house had to be thinking, that's a real head scratcher. You got some explanation here, Jesus. Again, Jesus is not afraid of that. Isn't that amazing? I got to tell you, if that was me, I'd be going, hey, I don't know her. I don't know her. Get away, get away. Not Jesus. He does not react that way. And now this will prompt the Pharisee that invited Jesus in to trap him. This is a perfect situation. Now, what is the Pharisee thinking? Well, we're about to find out. By the way, this is a win-win for the Pharisee. It is a win-win. Number one, he has just embarrassed himself, making it look like he has this relationship with this lady of the night. Number two, if he doesn't know her, that's even better, because he can't be a prophet. He has no idea what her background is, what she does for a living. This moment is without a doubt a win-win for that Pharisee whose name we'll find out now is Simon. A very common name, but this guy had everything he dreamed of in this moment. And so we go on to verse 39. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself. Have you ever said something to yourself and truly believed that yourself was the only one who heard it? You're about to find out that when you say things to ourselves and we're sure nobody hears it, Jesus hears it. That should scare you a little bit, I would think. And he says to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman is touching him. She's a sinner. She is scum. Now we're used to saying, well, everybody's a sinner. In that day and age, to use that word, that Greek word is erroneous, she's in error, was not just, oh, she made a mistake. She is an absolute embarrassment to her family, friends, and society as a whole. That's who she is. He can't be a prophet. He's got to be smiling as he says this to himself. So you got to love verse 40. Then Jesus answered his thoughts. Oh, man. Again, how does that feel for you to know? For me to know? When I have thoughts, Jesus knows them and answers them. Simon, he said to the Pharisee, I have something to say to you. Great! Go ahead, teacher, Simon replied. No problem, bring it on, because I'm going to nail you, is what Simon's thinking. So the irony here is so thick that Jesus knows his thoughts, and Jesus is being treated as though he's not a prophet. He's not just a prophet. Prophets don't typically know thoughts of people. He's way beyond a prophet. So we go on to verse 41. Then Jesus told him this story. A man loaned money to two people. 500 pieces of silver, that's about a year and a half's wages for the common worker, to one, and 50 to another. 50 would be about 2 months' wages for the common worker. But neither of them could repay him, so he kindly forgave them both, canceling their debts. Who do you suppose loved him more after that, Simon? Pause right here. Do you see why we ask so many questions in the upper room? Jesus is constantly asking questions. It's such a great way to teach, and it's such an important part of learning to live in the kingdom. Asking questions. You may say, I get tired of all the questions we have to talk about. Then you would have gotten tired of being around Jesus, because he asked questions constantly. And he asks Simon a question here, and this is really a no-brainer. He can hit this out of the park. He gives him an easy one. Simon answered, I suppose the one for whom he canceled the larger debt. Okay, notice he doesn't say, oh, I got the answer. He's like, come on. This is easy. I suppose that's the answer. That's right, Jesus said. And I think Jesus said it just like, that's right, Simon. You're tracking with me, big guy. That's right. Watch this. Verse 44. Then he turned to the woman and said to Simon. Brilliant. He's been looking at Simon. He turns back towards her. So he now includes both of them in what he's about to teach. Looks at the woman, talks to him. Brilliant by Jesus. Look at this woman kneeling here. When I entered your home, you didn't offer me water to wash the dust from my feet, but she washed them with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You didn't greet me with a kiss, but from the time I first came in, she has not stopped kissing my feet. You neglected the courtesy of olive oil to anoint my head, but she has anointed my feet with rare perfume. Wow. As you can imagine, the things he just talks about were customary. It was the way it worked. When you walked into a home in the Middle East, they washed your feet, they anointed you with olive oil. They might even, if they were so glad to see you, give you a kiss. And he says, you did none of that. She's done it all, and this isn't even her home. What is Jesus saying? Don't miss it. Simon, in your calculations of what goodness looks like, on the scale of goodness where you are at the top, I'm telling you, she is better than you. That's what he's saying. This hooker, this streetwalker, this person you think is the scum of the earth is better than you based on your scale of goodness. And then he goes on. I tell you her sins, and they are many. See, he's not denying who she is and what she's done. They are many. You know, she has had a troubled life and she's made a lot of mistakes. They are many. They have been forgiven. So she has shown me so much love. But a person who is forgiven little shows only little love. Then Jesus said to the woman, your sins are forgiven. The men at the table, and you can imagine there are other Pharisees for sure, said to themselves, who is this man that he goes around forgiving sins? This is outrageous. It's outlandish. And they declare that Jesus is claiming to be God. And this verifies their suspicion about him, and he's got to be done away with. Verse 50, and Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. To summarize this scene, there's a Messiah. There's a Madam of the Night. And there's a morally upright, better than everybody, expert in the law. And what happens here is uncanny. Discussion question. What do you think of what happened here in this scene? And the second part of the question is, what role do you think you would have been playing in that scenario? So I have a question that I want to ponder with you now that you've discussed it. Are most of our observations based on the physical, the emotional, or the intellectual? What do you think? When you observed what happened in that scenario, were you thinking about the physical details of it, the emotional tension going on, the intellectual piece of what was going on there? I believe this event, like all events where we see Jesus interacting with people, is one of the spiritual nature. Okay, was there physical things going on? Yes. We'll talk about that. Emotional, intellectual, yes. But the bottom line of this interaction was spiritual in nature, because we are by nature spiritual beings. That's what our nature is. That's who we truly are. All right? And for us to look at anything and say, oh, it's about the physical, the emotional, the intellectual, we must begin with the spiritual. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 8, second part of it, Paul writes this: we fix our gaze on things that cannot be seen. Not the physical, not the intellectual, not the emotional. For the things we see now will soon be gone, but the things we cannot see will last forever. The spiritual nature of who we are will last forever. My body, how I think, how I feel is not going to last forever. It is my spiritual nature. It is my soul that will last forever. Think about the physical things that were going on in that scenario. There's water, there's tears, there's kissing, right? There's all that stuff going on. Think about the emotional. She was very emotional, shedding tears on this teacher. Simon was emotional because he was frustrated that Jesus could not see who she really was, but inwardly he was probably elated that he had him now. And the other guys sitting around the table were angry. Who does he think he is that he can pretend to be God? All kinds of emotions. How about the intellectual games going on? Jesus is reading the mind of Simon and all that going on. But in essence, this is a story about spirituality. That is who we are, and we tend to come to that observation last, and we need to begin with that observation. Now let me go off the track for a moment. Do you know what spatial disorientation is? You've probably heard about it. Let me read to you a definition of it. It is the inability to determine position or relative motion commonly occurring during periods of challenging visibility. In aviation, spatial disorientation can result in an improper perception of the attitude of the aircraft, referring to the motion of the aircraft. For aviators, proper recognition of aircraft attitude is most critical at night and in poor weather. Spatial disorientation has led to numerous aviation accidents. Okay, so you've heard of that. How a pilot can just lose all sense of what direction he's going, and maybe even if he or she is upside down. There's been stories of even military pilots who didn't realize they were upside down and they plunged as they thought they were going to go up in the sky, plunged to the earth. Spatial disorientation, all right? I want to suggest to you that what's going on in this scene, in this scenario in Luke chapter 7, is not spatial disorientation, but spiritual disorientation. Now, we all know that 2020 and into 2021 was a very challenging time in our culture and around the world, and a lot of things happened. I mean, you could take forever to unpack all that took place. But one of the most simple things to understand, seemingly, during that time, 2020 to 21, 48,183 people in our country committed suicide. I don't know about you, that boggles my imagination. 48,000 people ended their lives. Suicide, in fact, rose by 36% during that time. And in 2021, it is said that an estimated 12.3 million Americans seriously thought about committing suicide. 12 million Americans thought about it. 3.5 million planned to commit suicide, and 1.7 million attempted suicide in that time period. Now, what's going on? Well, it would be fairly obvious to say, well, there's some serious emotional things going on. You know, there might have been some physical problems that people are having. I want to tell you, just like I told you about this Luke 7 passage, that is evidence of a spiritual problem. And that's where we have to land. I believe it's spiritual disorientation. Now, we're going to transition now back to John 3, where we're studying the life of Jesus. And again, I tell you that Luke 7 passage, I believe Simon and his buddies have spiritual disorientation. They don't realize spiritually what they're a part of and how important it is they get rightly aligned with the God they claim to know and to serve. So as we turn back to John 3, remember, Jesus has been talking to Nicodemus, and Nicodemus, he's talked about, you must be born again. And then he goes into that famous passage, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes on him shall not perish but have eternal life. And we studied that last week, but now we go on, and it seems like he kind of veers off into left field with this conversation about judgment. What does judgment have to do with the love of God, right? This is what he's going to do, and I think it's really cool. He's going to talk about judgment, but then he's going to put it in context. And so we'll go through the part on judgment, not say much about it, but then we'll look closely at the context. All right. So here we go. John chapter 3, verse 17. God sent his Son into the world not to judge the world, but to save the world through him. Now, is Jesus going to be the ultimate judge? He is, but he did not come the first time to this earth to judge. Going on, verse 18. There is no judgment against anyone who believes in him, but anyone who does not believe in him has already been judged for not believing in God's one and only Son. And the judgment is based on this fact. Now comes the context for judgment. Let me pause, however, and remind you that 3 times in verse 18, Jesus uses the word believe. Again, it's the word pisteuo, which means confidence. Those who place their confidence in Jesus as the Son of God to the point where they give their lives to him, let him run their lives. Not just say, yeah, he existed. Yeah, he's alive. Remember, it's not just saying Jesus existed. He lived on this earth. Simon and his Pharisee brothers knew that Jesus lived, but they did not believe in him. They did not place their lives in his hands. Really important. Now, what is the context of judgment? Remember what he just said. You are not judged because I came to judge you. You are judged because of what I'm about to tell you. Here we go. God's light came into the world, but people loved the darkness more than the light, for their actions were evil. All who do evil hate the light and refuse to go near it for fear their sins will be exposed. But those who do what is right come to the light so that others can see what they're doing is what God wants. The context for judgment is about the light. Who is the light? What is the light? Got to be careful here, because many of us, and I would include Simon the Pharisee in this and his buddies, believe that we're a part of the light because we're moral, because of all the things that we see that are good about us. Here is the takeaway for this lesson. Are you ready? The light is not morality. It is not conservatism. It is not religion. It is not church attendance. It is not goodness. And it is not kindness. You can be good and kind and religious and attend church without being a part of the light. Simon and his buddies are a picture of that. Many amongst us are pictures of that. It is not any of those things. Then what is it, Steve? It's not a what, it's a who. Jesus, and Jesus alone is the light. That's what John has already told us in his gospel. And nothing short of being an apprentice to Jesus, entrusting your life to Jesus, letting him run your life, is living in the light. And so you got to be very careful, because Simon and his buddies believed they were good people. And they believed that God was pleased with them. And many people today believe we are good people and God is pleased with us because we're conservatives, because we're kind and we're gentle and we're good and we go to church. None of that matters. Anything short of surrendering, submitting our life to Jesus, letting him run our lives, is not living in the light. Dallas Willard, in his book Divine Conspiracy, puts it this way: when we see Jesus as he is, we must turn away or else shamelessly adore him. There's only two options. When you truly come to understand who Jesus is, you've got to run from him or shamelessly adore him and worship him. Those are the only two options. Now, to be honest with you, because of the culture in which we live, having only two options is far too few options. We firmly believe that we deserve multiple options. A Cornell University study found that we have 227 food options every day. Did you know that? 227. I get to choose from 227 options just in my eating life every day. And you're telling me there's only two options in all of life? Psychology Today claims that we make 35,000 choices in a day. So wonder we're so tired at night when you say, and Kristen and I say this, why are we so tired? You know, the answer is, I made 35,000 choices today. That's why I'm so tired. But with all of that being ingrained in us, and then here comes Jesus saying, there is the light, and you can come to the light or go from the light. Those are your only two options. We just simply seldom will agree with that to be the case. In fact, as I've said before, the modern church has capitulated to this society and this culture because the modern church believes that one of the roles is to provide as many options as possible because that's what the consumers, the customers demand, and that's the modern church. We'll have none of this only two options business in the modern church, right? And this brings us to our location. It is not an important location. There's no important crossroads behind me. There's no important building behind me. There's no history of anything behind me. It's simply this, a sign. A sign. See that T sign? That tells me, and it tells you, when you come upon a T sign, I'm coming to a moment here where I only have two options. But I must make a choice between the two options. I must go left or I must go right. That's it. There are times in life when there are only two options, and I believe that's what Jesus is saying. This concept that Jesus uses here is so in our face that we just don't want to think about it. Remember the screw tape letters we've talked about, C.S. Lewis's ingenious book where he imagines a demon writing instructions to his nephew Wormwood, Uncle Screw Tape, and in that letter, in one of those letters, I want to read to you what he says to Wormwood, because he's telling his nephew, you don't have to do dramatic things to get what we want done here. And here is what he says. Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one. The gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. Don't let them see the T signpost. Don't let them see that you have to make a decision. And there's got to be something dramatic that takes place in your life at this moment, is what the demons believe. I think C.S. Lewis is on to something, don't you? This thing we just need to kind of coast gradually into a life that we think we're in the light, but the truth is, I still live for myself. I've never abandoned myself to Jesus. Again, John has already said in chapter 1, verse 4, in him, in Jesus, was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. He illuminates everything. He illuminates our lives. He illuminates everything in the universe. It's who He is. And so we have become very uncomfortable with the idea of the shadowy parts of my life being exposed. And so we're attracted to, especially in the sense of church communities, places where nothing will be exposed. No one will ask me hard questions. Nothing will be demanded of me, that my selfishness might be put on display for others and someone might hold me accountable. We're uncomfortable with that. And that is exactly one of the many things I love about the upper room. If you're in the upper room, and so many of you are, you have signed on to being uncomfortable. You have signed on to letting the light expose even the dark corners of your life because you want so much to be real as you live for Jesus. We know that we're not the light. We're to be the light to the world because Jesus shines through us. But Jesus is the only light of the world, the true light, capital L-I-G-H-T. And so it begs the question, and I'll bet you've never asked this question before. So, are we moths or roaches? I've mentioned that when I was in my second year of college, I jumped in a van with 15 other people and we drove to New York City. It was like a 30-hour drive. We got to New York City, and there we worked in the Love Mission on West 49th Street in Manhattan, New York City, and we had so many great adventures and stories. I mentioned, I think I met Arnold Schwarzenegger, and it snowed a foot while we were there. I had opening day baseball tickets to the New York Yankees, and it snowed a foot. One of the highlights for me personally is that it was the first time I ever got to preach on Easter morning. But one of the most memorable things that happened was the first night we were there. We went out walking throughout New York City, and just Times Square blew us away in a disgusting way. But when we came back to the mission and it was all dark, we flipped on the lights and the floor moved. It was a linoleum concrete floor, and it moved. Not because there was an earthquake, but because hundreds and hundreds of cockroaches had been on that floor, and they scattered. They were gone in less than a second. It was amazing. I never forgot it. Now, what's it have to do with our lesson? I think you're getting it, right? Cockroaches, roaches in general, run from the light. They hide from the light. All you have to do is turn on the light. In the night, it's scary to think, what's going on in your kitchen, right? I don't have to tell you, but I will. We slept for a week in New York City with the lights on at night. We were not going to turn those lights off, being covered in roaches, right? Roaches run from the light. You know that a moth, which by the way has been transformed from a caterpillar as well, a moth is drawn to the light. Scientists really don't know why, but they have some guesses, but moths are drawn to the light. They fly to the light. You've seen that happen. So I take you back to what Jesus said, verse 20 of John 3. All who do evil hate the light. They refuse to go near it, for their sins will be exposed. They run from the light. They're roaches. Verse 21, but those who do what is right come to the light. They fly to the light so others can see that what they are doing is what God wants. What a stark contrast, right? When we look back at Luke 7, who are the roaches? Who are the moths? What is the light? You know what it is, don't you? The light is Jesus. He comes into that room, and then a moth is drawn to him. The moths are not pretty. They're not butterflies, right? But they're drawn to him. And that moth, as ugly of a life as she had lived, was drawn to him. And the roaches were irate, and in a way, in the spiritual sense, they ran and hid from him. They were angry. You have the light. You have moths. You have roaches. And they all played a role, and to this day, I believe we all play that role. The light is here. He came. His Spirit is now here as the light. We are either drawn to him, or we are afraid to be exposed by him, and so we must align ourselves as one of those creatures. Moths, nothing special about them. There's nothing special about me. How about you? You know? Just an everyday person. I can tell you one thing, I'm drawn to the light. Most of you I know are drawn to the light. But I also know a lot of people who think of themselves as butterflies. Simon the Pharisee thought of himself as a butterfly. Look at me. I am special. And he ended up running from the light. And so the safe thing to do, the comfortable thing to do, is to be a roach. Is to run and hide just at the thought of anything in your life being exposed for people to see. And so I urge you, I want to compel you to be a moth, to just fly close to the flame, fly close to the light, and be drawn to the light, because that is the only hope for us. It has nothing to do with your goodness, your kindness, your church attendance, your political affiliation. All that stuff that seems to be important is absolutely unimportant, because there's only one of two ways to go. There's only left or right. There's only go toward the light or go ahead and be a roach and run away from it. But you got to make a choice. It's that simple. There aren't 35,000 choices really when it comes down to it. We just passed the 60-year anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States. And Christy and I love to kind of read about it and talk about it, watch documentaries on this event that took place that really changed our society as a whole. I was very young, so I don't remember, but I know my parents have always said I knew exactly where I was on that moment, where we were. It was a big deal, big deal. He had a son, and they called him John John. At least the public called him John John. He was John F. Kennedy Jr., and he was just 3 days short of his third birthday when his father was assassinated. You probably have seen the famous footage, or maybe a picture of him, of John John, saluting the casket of his father as it went by. It was one of those pictures, you know, there's just a few pictures that are iconic when it comes to our culture. That was one for sure. And by the way, that was all staged. His mom told him what to do, when to do it. If you watch all the footage, you can see her bending down saying, okay, now salute, you know. So although it was like a spontaneous thing, it really wasn't. But that's what he's famous for. Well, John John grew up, as you know, and in 1999, at the age of 38, he had the swagger of his father, the looks of his father. He created a magazine, all these kinds of things. But when he was 38 in the summer of 1999, he got into an airplane. He had been taking flying lessons. His flying teacher told him, I can go with you, but he didn't want him to go. He took with him his wife and her sister. And so the plan was to drop the sister-in-law off at Martha's Vineyard. They would ultimately be going to a wedding at the Kennedy complex there in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, but they took off from New Jersey, and 62 minutes later, they plunged into the Atlantic Ocean, and they all died. When the National Transportation Board did their investigation, they discovered, and the discovery came out, the explanation came out in the year 2000, that what had happened, and let me read it to you, was that they had crashed because of his inexperience, and he'd become disoriented and lost control of his plane in the dark, hazy night. Translation, spatial disorientation. What a tragedy. What a tragedy. It didn't need to happen. You know, if he had just allowed his flight instructor to go with him, probably that guy had enough experience, he could have dealt with it. Spatial disorientation. It doesn't need to happen necessarily. In that case, it didn't need to happen. 3 people did not need to die. However, and many people said, well, that's just the Kennedy curse, and that's a whole different topic. But the point is this, we don't deal very often. I doubt if I'll ever deal with spatial disorientation. But there's a great chance that you and I, at some point, will deal with spiritual disorientation. We get disoriented. We get turned around. We're not sure which side is up. That's what happened to Simon and his buddies. It's like they're in the presence of God, and they're spiritually disoriented. They think it's all about their goodness, about what they've accomplished. I again implore you that going to the light, that claiming that Jesus is the only way to know what life is about, because he knows the truth about us and about the universe, and then he shows us how to live. That must be the direction we take. You are at a T, every day of your life, I'm at a T every day of my life, will I turn to the light or will I be a roach and run and hide? The roaches simply cannot afford to be exposed for who they truly are. Last question of the day, not a discussion question. What did we learn about God? We always learn something about the Father by learning about Jesus, by listening to Jesus. What did we learn about the Father? I can tell you what I think I've learned about the Father from this passage, from that Luke 7 passage, and that is this: the Father is merciful and gracious to moths. But on the other hand, he's outrageously horrifying to roaches. I think the implications are pretty obvious, aren't they? What a fascinating way to understand judgment. Judgment is not a set-apart topic that we need to talk about. Judgment is pretty obvious. I'll either be judged and found worthy or unworthy, but it's not based on me being a butterfly. It's based on me being a moth who's been drawn to the light. And the light is my only hope. And the light is your only hope. And it's in that context that judgment makes total sense. I have decided, I've come to the T in my life, and I've decided every single day to go to the light, to live in the light, to revel in the light. Thank God for His Son, who teaches us about the Father and shows us what life is all about. Thanks for joining us on this unremarkable intersection just outside of Montrose. We love you all. Thanks for doing the journey with us.